Picture this. You studied everything. You understood it at home, alone, at midnight. You could explain every concept to yourself without hesitation. Then you walked into the exam hall. Sat down. And forgot everything. Not because the subject was hard. But because suddenly it wasn't just you and the subject anymore. There were eyes on you. Expectations on you. And your brain chose survival over algebra. You've probably spent years believing you're bad at something. Maybe it's math. Maybe it's science. Maybe it's English. And somewhere along the way, you accepted it. You stopped trying as hard. You sat at the back. You told yourself it just wasn't your thing. But here's the question nobody ever asked you. When exactly did you decide that? Because there was a moment. A specific moment. Before that moment, you were just a person learning something. After that moment, you were someone who was bad at it. And almost always, that moment had nothing to do with the subject itself. It had everything to do with someone watching you. In 1908, two psychologists named Robert Yerkes and John Dodson ran a series of experiments trying to understand how pressure affects performance. What they found became one of the most important ideas in psychology. A small amount of pressure improves performance. Your brain sharpens. You focus. You care enough to try harder. But past a certain point, more pressure does the opposite. Performance doesn't just stop improving. It starts getting worse. The same brain that was working perfectly suddenly makes mistakes it would never make alone. Scientists call the peak of that curve optimal arousal. Past that point, you're no longer performing. You're surviving. And here's the thing about exams nobody talks about. The subject didn't change between your bedroom and the exam hall. The pressure did. You crossed the peak of that curve the moment you remembered that other people's opinions were attached to what you were about to write. But the Yerkes-Dodson curve only explains what happens in the exam hall. It doesn't explain why you stopped believing in yourself long before the exam even started. That part begins with comparison. Think about the student in your class who always gets the highest marks. You know the one. They finish early. They look relaxed. The teacher smiles at them differently. Now here's what that does to your brain. Social comparison is not a choice. It's a biological reflex. Researchers have found that being outperformed by others activates some of the same brain regions involved in physical discomfort. Your brain doesn't simply see someone doing better. It sees a threat. So every time that student finishes early and you haven't, your brain files a quiet report. You're behind. You're losing. You're less. Do that enough times and the subject stops being a subject. It becomes the place where you lose. But here is where it gets darker. Because so far we've only talked about other students. We haven't talked about the teacher. And the teacher is where this story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. In 1968, psychologist Robert Rosenthal walked into an elementary school with a fake test. He told teachers it could identify students who were about to experience a major intellectual growth spurt. The teachers believed him. After the test, he handed them a list of names. These students, he said, were about to bloom academically. There was only one problem. The list was completely random. The students weren't special. The test wasn't real. But by the end of the year, those students showed significantly greater intellectual growth. Why? Because the teachers believed they would. They treated them slightly differently. A little more patience. A little more encouragement. A little more expectation. Not enough to notice. But enough to matter. Rosenthal called this the Pygmalion Effect. What people expect from you can influence what you become. Not metaphorically. Measurably. And that means the opposite can be true too. A teacher who quietly decides you're not a math person may communicate that belief rough. Hundreds of tiny signals. A shorter explanation. Less patience. Lower expectations. Nothing obvious. Nothing intentional. But enough. And slowly, without ever being told directly, you begin to agree. The subject never failed you. The subject was naive or the problem. The problem was a classroom full of comparisons. A system full of expectations. And a brain running a survival program in a place that was supposed to be safe for learning. Eventually, you stopped saying this subject makes me anxious. And started saying I'm just bad at this. So if expectations shape ability this powerfully, researchers had one obvious next question. What happens when you remove them entirely? In 2010, a team studying academic motivation divided students into two groups studying the same subject. The first group studied because they genuinely found it interesting. The second group studied because they wanted good grades, parental approval, or to avoid disappointment. Same subject. Same material. Same amount of time. By the end of the study, the first group significantly outperformed the second. Not slightly. Significantly. The students who were trying to understand something did better than the students who were trying to impress someone. Every single time. The researchers had a name for these two states. Internal motivation, doing something because the thing itself interests you. External motivation, doing something because of what other people will think when you do it. And here is the part that should make you uncomfortable. Most students spend their entire academic life in external motivation without ever realizing it. You don't study math. You study math for your parents. You don't learn science. You perform science for your teacher. You don't understand history. You survive history for the exam. The subject becomes a vehicle for other people's opinions. And then you wonder why it feels like work. Think about something you genuinely enjoy outside of school. A game. A sport. A creative skill. Anything. You probably got good at it without anyone grading you. You made mistakes and tried again without it meaning anything about who you are. You improved without a ranking system telling you where you stood. That is what learning feels like without an audience. That is what every subject could feel like. Not easy. Not effortless. But yours. The subject you think you hate might be the subject you were never actually allowed to try. Because every time you approached it, the audience arrived first. Your teacher's quiet certainty about why our ceiling. That student finishing early making your effort feel like proof of something. Your parents' hope sitting on your shoulders like a weight the question paper never asked you to carry. You were never fighting the subject. You were fighting everyone who had an opinion about how well you should be able to do it. And you have been blaming the subject ever since. The subject never had an opinion about you. The equation didn't think you were stupid. The textbook didn't decide you weren't talented. The chapter didn't write you off. People did. And after hearing those expectations long enough, you started repeating them to yourself. That is how expectations become identity. Not in one moment. Through repetition. The teacher's words become your inner voice. The comparison becomes your self-assessment. The ranking becomes the story you carry into every room for the rest of your life. But here is what that story leaves out. The student who sat next to you and always scored higher was not fighting the SAE battle you were. They were not smarter. They were not more capable. They were just, for whatever reason, slightly less afraid of the audience. That is the only difference. Not talent. Not intelligence. Not some quality you were either born with or not. Just a quieter relationship with the people watching. And that is something that can change. Because the exam was never testing who you are. It was testing what you could do on a particular day, under a particular set of conditions, in front of a particular audience. Those are not the same thing. You are not your marks. You are not your rank. You are not the story your teacher wrote about you in the first 3 weeks of term. You are what happens when the audience leaves and the subject is just sitting there waiting. Quiet. Neutral. With no opinion about you whatsoever. What could you become if you stopped treating other people's expectations as the truth? That question has always been yours to answer. The room is quiet now.